Rain drove sideways across the cemetery the morning Martha Avery buried her brother. She stood beside Elias Bell's grave in a borrowed black coat, the only relative who had come. There had once been 5 Bell children. 2 were already dead, and the other 2 lived closest enough to make the drive. Gordon never left his house. Sheila sent no message. For most of 40 years, both of them had treated Elias as the family embarrassment. He played old mountain songs, fixed discarded tape machines, and refused every sensible plan they offered him. At holiday tables, Gordon called him lazy. Sheila preferred a softer word, hopeless, which somehow cut deeper. Martha had never understood Elias either, but she had answered his calls, mailed him birthday cards, and never told him to stop being who he was. That was apparently enough to make her the only Bell beneath the cemetery tent. Elias was 76 when he died alone in his weathered house above a narrow creek in southwest Virginia. The county posted notices at the property and waited for someone to deal with the unpaid taxes. No one did. For almost 2 years, Martha carried the house key in the bottom of her purse. She did not visit. The place belonged to a part of Elias's life she had always watched from the edge. Then a delinquent tax notice arrived at the rented room where she was living. The county intended to sell the property if the balance was not paid. Gordon received the same notice and ignored it. So did Sheila. Martha read hers at the kitchen table until the numbers blurred. The old garment plant where she had worked most of her life had closed years earlier. Her Social Security check covered rent, food, medicine, and almost nothing beyond that. Her hands were stiff from decades of feeding fabric beneath industrial needles. On bad mornings, buttoning a coat took patience. She still got a coffee tin down from the top cabinet. Inside was the emergency money she had saved in 10s and 20s. At the county treasurer's office, she counted out just over $1,600. The clerk looked from the bills to the property record on her screen. "That's most of what the place is worth to the county," she said carefully. Martha smoothed the stamped receipt under her thumb. She said, what she could not explain was that she was not buying a house. She was preventing Elias from being discarded a second time. The next morning she drove west until the pavement narrowed, then ended. A gravel road followed the creek through a wooded cut locals called Morrow Hollow. 3 miles later, gravel became twin ruts with grass growing between them. Martha's old station wagon crawled the final stretch. The house appeared beyond a stand of bare sycamores. It leaned toward the creek as if one hard winter might finally convince it to lie down. One end of the porch had sunk. A corner of the metal roof had lifted. Plastic and cardboard covered one broken front window. Martha remained behind the wheel for several minutes. $1,600 suddenly felt like a decision made by another woman. Then she took the iron key from her purse. The padlock resisted before giving with a rusty snap. When she pushed the front door inward, cold air carried the smell of mildew, mice, and wet plaster. The front room seemed to confirm every insult the family had ever made. A chair had collapsed against one wall. Water stains ran from the ceiling. Leaves had blown through the broken window and collected along the baseboard. Martha nearly turned around. Then she noticed an interior door at the back of the room. It fit its frame cleanly. Nothing else in the house was square. She crossed the soft floor and lifted the latch. The air beyond the door was dry. It smelled faintly of cedar machine oil and old magnetic tape. A long workbench filled one wall. A reel-to-reel recorder sat under a clean cotton cover. Shelves rose almost to the ceiling, crowded with boxed tapes. Each box carried a pencil label in Elias's slow block printing. A battered guitar hung beside 3 harmonicas. His dented thermos still stood at one end of the bench. The chair beside it had been worn smooth by the shape of one body. Martha stayed in the doorway until her eyes adjusted. The ruined house had protected one room. More than that, Elias had protected it himself. She could see where he had sealed the window frame, raised the shelves above floor level, and kept tools wrapped against damp. This had not been a hobby abandoned in a back room. It had been work. Martha touched nothing that first hour. She simply stood among hundreds of tapes and let her idea of her brother become less certain. Then she did what she had always done when a feeling was too large to hold. She found a bucket. She cleaned. By afternoon, the leaves were gone from the front room. By evening, the workbench had been wiped without disturbing a single label. Martha slept that night on a folding cot beside Elias's old chair. The room she had rented above a hardware store in town was no longer hers. Between the tax payment and her ordinary bills, she had no money left to keep it. The leaning house at the end of Morrow Hollow was now the only roof she had. For 3 days she worked one corner at a time. She patched the broken window with heavy plastic. She cleared mouse nests from the pantry. She tightened a loose porch board with screws from Elias's bench. The back room warmed once the drafts were stopped. On the second day, Martha found an older harmonica wrapped in soft flannel inside a drawer. Its metal cover had been rubbed almost bare where Elias's thumb had rested. She slipped it into her apron pocket. After that, it stayed there. Before dawn on the fourth morning, Martha stepped outside with a bucket of gray wash water. A person was curled beneath the porch overhang. The girl woke at the scrape of Martha's boot and came upright at once. She was maybe 19, thin, watchful, and dressed in a jacket too light for the cold. A backpack lay beneath her head. Martha recognized the expression before she recognized anything else. It was the look of someone waiting to be told to leave. Martha had worn that look herself in rented rooms and temporary jobs, so she did not ask questions in the yard. "Coffee's hot," she said toward the house. "There's oatmeal if you want some." Then she went inside and set out 2 bowls. The girl came in 10 minutes later, driven by hunger and the cold. She ate quickly with one hand close to her backpack. Her name was Tess Monroe. She had turned 18 the previous spring and aged out of foster care that summer. No one had thrown her out exactly. The calls had simply stopped. The placement had ended, and adulthood had arrived without a place to stand. Martha did not ask about parents. She knew enough to hear an absence without making someone explain it. Tess stared at the tape shelves while she ate. "I used to come up here when I was little," she said. One foster home had been down the county road. When things got bad there, she would walk up the hollow and sit beneath Elias's porch. She had never gone inside. She had listened through the wall while the old man played. Once she had asked through an open window why he kept playing if nobody was there. Tess frowned, trying to remember his answer exactly. He said music doesn't disappear just because nobody's listening yet. Martha looked toward the covered machine. That sounded like Elias, but she had never heard him say it. Tess finished the oatmeal and washed her own bowl. She stayed near the door that first day. The next morning she held the ladder while Martha sealed a gap under the eaves. By afternoon she was carrying warped boards to the burn pile without being asked. Martha did not call the arrangement anything. Neither did Tess. They simply stopped pretending the girl was leaving after breakfast. 2 days later, Martha worked down the lowest tape shelf with a rag. Her fingers caught on a seam in the cypress paneling behind it. 40 years at a sewing machine had trained her eye for small failures in alignment. A hem could hide a repair. A matching patch could hide a tear. This wall hid something. One run of tongue and groove boards sat a fraction out of rhythm with the rest. Martha pressed her palm against it. The panel flexed. Tess noticed the stillness and came to the doorway. Martha found a narrow pry bar among Elias's tools. She eased it into the top seam and worked slowly so the old wood would not split. A line of dried adhesive released with a low crack. The 3-foot panel swung outward on concealed hinges. Behind it was a built-in cabinet lined with cedar and roofing felt. The air inside was cool and dry. 3 shelves held tapes unlike the working reels in the room. Each one had been wrapped in oilcloth, tied and labeled with a person's name. Martha lifted the nearest bundle. The pencil read Mabel Carver Cradle Songs. Another read Jonas Pike Old Ballads, Complete Verses. A third carried the name Lena Monroe. Tess stopped breathing for a second. "Monroe?" Martha looked at her. Tess shook her head. "I don't know, maybe nothing." But she moved closer. A thick black ledger lay on the bottom shelf, wrapped in canvas. Martha untied it and opened the cover. Elias had filled the pages by hand. Each entry began with a name. Beneath it he listed a song, where he had heard it, who had taught it, and what the singer remembered. One woman had been the last person Elias knew who could sing a missing verse. One man would only sing after sunset because he was embarrassed by his voice. Another entry described a lullaby passed from mother to daughter since the Depression. Martha turned another page and found the name of a woman who had rocked her to sleep when she was 6. She had not thought about that voice in half a century. He had found the woman years later and recorded the song before she died. Martha lowered herself onto the floor. The ledger made the shelves around her change shape. They were no longer boxes of a lonely man's music. They were people. At the back of the cabinet, behind the ledger, lay a sealed envelope. It was wrapped more carefully than anything else. Across the front, Elias had written Martha. She knew the hand immediately. It was the same uneven printing from 70 years of birthday cards and grocery notes. She opened the envelope. The first page was a handwritten will. Elias left the house, the recording room, the tapes, the ledger, and any rights attached to the collection to Martha. He named her to handle the estate. A second sheet was a personal note. Martha read the first sentence and had to stop. Tess sat on the floor across from her and waited. Eventually, Martha tried again. Elias wrote that he trusted her because she was the only sibling who had never tried to shut him out of the family. He knew she did not understand the work. He also knew she had never mocked it. He asked her to protect the recordings long enough to learn what they were. Martha pressed her fingers against her mouth. All those years she had thought she was merely the sister who tolerated what the others could not. Elias had experienced that tolerance as loyalty. Near the end of the ledger, a sentence had been underlined once. Tess read it aloud. A voice can wait a long time for the right person to hear it. The words were not exactly what Tess remembered from the window. The meaning was, Martha touched the line with one stiff fingertip. Then she noticed a reel already threaded on the machine. Elias must have left it there the last time he worked. Martha's hand rested on the power switch. She could not press it. Hearing a dead stranger was one thing. Hearing whatever Elias had last heard felt different. Tess came to stand beside her. She did not touch Martha. She simply stayed. That was enough. Martha turned the machine on. The reels moved. Static rose first, soft and warm. Then a woman's untrained voice filled the room. She sang a slow cradle song about a creek at night and daylight returning. Tess covered her mouth. Martha turned toward her. "I know this," Tess whispered. The words came unevenly. A woman at Tess's first foster placement had sung the same melody when Tess was very small. She had forgotten the song so completely that she had forgotten she had ever known it. Now the old tape gave part of her childhood back. Tess cried without making a sound. Martha rested one hand on her shoulder. They listened until the reel ran out. When the room went quiet, Martha understood one thing clearly. The collection could not remain hidden inside a wall. The next morning, Martha wrapped 3 reels in a clean towel and drove back to town. A narrow repair shop sat beside the laundromat on Main Street. Its owner, Leonard Griggs, had repaired radios, turntables, and tape machines for more than 40 years. He accepted the first reel with the polite caution of a man used to attic discoveries. Then he threaded it. The singer reached the second verse. Leonard stopped moving. He replayed 8 measures, adjusted the speed, cleaned the tape head, and listened again. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Martha told him about Elias and the room in Morrow Hollow. Leonard removed his glasses. He knew the kind of recordings he was hearing. They were original field tapes made in kitchens, front rooms, church basements, and porches. Some of the songs existed in published forms. Others had regional verses scholars had spent decades trying to document. Many of the singers named on the boxes had died. If Elias had recorded them before their songs disappeared, the collection could matter far beyond Redfern County. "Don't let anybody carry a box out of that house yet," Leonard said. Martha asked why. "Because once people know something is scarce, they start calling greed expertise." He offered to help her make working copies so the originals would not be damaged. He also asked permission to call a folklorist he trusted at a university several hours east. Martha agreed. She went home with the same 3 reels and a different understanding of their risk. News still traveled faster than caution in a small county. Within a week, people began coming up the road. Most arrived quietly. They had heard that Elias Bell had recordings of parents, grandparents, neighbors, and singers nobody had heard in decades. Martha played only what the ledger clearly identified. One evening, a retired nursing aide named June Carver came directly from work. The ledger pointed Martha to a tape made at June's mother's kitchen table. June expected to hear her mother. 2 minutes into the song, a man's lower harmony entered beneath the melody. June gripped the edge of the workbench. "That's Daddy." Her father had died when June was 20. No home movie held his voice. For 50 years she had remembered his laugh imperfectly, and his speaking voice hardly at all. Now he was singing a harmony because Elias had decided one ordinary evening was worth recording. June sat down and cried openly. Martha drove her back to the bottom of the hollow after dark. On the return trip, she finally understood why Elias had written names before song titles. He had not been collecting music as objects. He had been refusing to let people vanish without a trace. Tess began helping with the visitors. She made coffee, wrote down family connections, and learned how to rewind tape without pulling it tight. She still slept lightly. She still kept her backpack packed, but she stopped placing it beside the door. Leonard's university contact arrived the following Thursday. Dr. Miriam Shaw taught public folklore and archival studies at a state university in Eastern Virginia. She wore cotton gloves when she handled the original tapes. Martha trusted her partly because Miriam did not gasp, praise, or start naming prices. She asked permission before opening anything. She listened. She took notes. She compared dates in the ledger to labels on the reels. She examined the storage conditions and the different batches of tape Elias had used over the years. The first day lasted until dark. Miriam returned the second morning. By late afternoon, she had read enough of the ledger to understand the scale of the work. Elias had documented hundreds of performances over roughly 4 decades. He had recorded family songs, work songs, ballad hymns, children's rhymes, and local variants that had never been commercially released. His notes linked songs to singers, families, dates, and lines of transmission. That documentation made the collection more useful than a stack of anonymous tapes. Miriam took off her gloves before she spoke about money. She told Martha that no responsible appraiser could promise a final number after 2 days. Condition, copyright, duplicate material, provenance, and institutional interest all had to be examined. But Martha had asked whether the collection was worth enough to protect professionally. Miriam answered that question. A cautious working range, she said, might fall somewhere between $275,000 and $425,000. It could come in lower. If rare material proved unique and licensing developed, it could rise beyond that. Martha read the figures in Miriam's notebook twice. Then she walked outside. The creek moved around stones exactly as it had the day before. The roof still needed work. Her station wagon still pulled to the right. Nothing visible had changed. Yet the woman who had nearly emptied her savings to stop a tax sale now owned something institutions might compete to preserve. Martha stayed on the porch until the numbers became information instead of noise. When she returned, Miriam had the ledger open. The tapes are important, she said, but this book may be the reason the whole collection holds together. Without the ledger, future listeners could hear voices. With it, they could know whose voices they were, how songs traveled, and what Elias had learned about the people. Miriam said a serious archive could build an entire named collection around such documentation. They would preserve Elias's name with it. That was the first part, Martha repeated. His name, Miriam said. Martha looked toward Elias's worn chair. All his life, relatives had spoken about him as though he had failed to become someone. Now a scholar wanted students to learn from what he had done. Miriam offered to help Martha arrange a formal appraisal and contact reputable archives. She also told her not to hurry. Time is one of the few advantages you have, she said. 3 days after Miriam left, a dark sedan climbed the road to the house. The man who stepped out wore polished shoes and a jacket too clean for the mud. He introduced himself as Grant Hollander from Northline Rights Group. He said he acquired archival music, master recordings, and small catalogs. Martha stayed in the doorway. Grant praised the house's character. Then he explained how difficult old tape could be. Humidity ruined recording. Rights were messy. Unknown performers sometimes created ownership questions. Legal review could consume more money than a collection produced. Martha listened without correcting him. Grant had made one mistake before he began negotiating. He never once asked where the tapes were. He looked through the front room as if he already knew the preserved room was behind it. Someone had told him far more than he admitted. Grant offered $20,000 for everything. The tapes, the ledger, the rights, and any related material. He described it as certainty for a woman who did not need years of lawyers and institutions. Martha said no. He raised the offer to $24,000. Martha thanked him and said no again. His smile narrowed. He offered $28,000 and called it generous. Martha's fingers closed around Elias's harmonica inside her apron pocket. No, Mr. Hollander. This time she did not add an explanation. Grant studied her for several seconds. He seemed less angry than confused. He had expected poverty to make the decision for her. At his car he turned back. Estates can get complicated when family starts asking who really owns what. The sentence was framed as advice. Martha heard the pressure inside it. Grant drove away without spinning a tire or raising his voice. 9 days later, a certified letter arrived from a law office in Richmond. The letter named Gordon Bell and Sheila Price as petitioners. Martha read it beside the workbench while morning light pushed through the patched front window. Her brother and sister claimed Elias's handwritten will might not be valid. They questioned whether he had been mentally clear when he wrote it. They questioned whether the handwriting was really his. They suggested Martha had influenced him because she was the person who benefited. If the will failed, they argued, the estate should be divided among the 3 surviving siblings. They asked the court to block any transfer or sale until the dispute was resolved. Martha set the letter beside Elias's ledger. For 2 years, Gordon and Sheila had allowed the taxes to accumulate. Neither had visited the house. Neither had attended the funeral. The possibility of a valuable archive had accomplished what grief never had. It had brought them back. That part hurt. The accusation hurt more. They were not only asking for money, they were asking a court to treat Elias's final decision as confusion. They were asking strangers to believe Martha had used the brother she had been the only one to keep answering. That night she sat at the bench long after Tess went to sleep. A working copy of one reel had finished playing. Its loose leader tapped softly against the machine as the take-up reel turned. Martha let the sound repeat. For the first time since entering the house, she wondered whether preserving it had been foolish. She had spent nearly everything. Now she faced lawyers she could not afford and siblings who suddenly had a reason to remember her phone number. Near dawn, she took Elias's letter out again. He had wrapped the will against damp. He had hidden it behind a fitted wall. He had kept decades of dated handwriting beside it. Whatever else Elias had been, careless was not the word. Martha stopped the empty reel. That morning she called Elaine Porter. Elaine practiced out of 2 rooms above a pharmacy in the county seat. She had handled wills, property disputes, and family fights for more than 30 years. She read Elias's will twice. Then she read several pages of the ledger. He expected somebody to challenge this, she said. Martha looked up. Elaine pointed to the wrapping, the date, and the placement of the papers. A man who thought his wishes would be accepted casually did not usually seal them behind a wall with his life's records. Elaine explained the problem without pretending there was no risk. The will was entirely in Elias's handwriting and clearly signed and dated. That gave Martha a strong foundation. But Gordon and Sheila were attacking the very fact that Elias wrote it. The cleanest answer would be neutral witnesses who knew his handwriting well and had no financial interest in the estate. Martha immediately thought of neighbors. Elaine shook her head. Neighbors whose parents appeared on the tapes could be portrayed as emotionally invested. Martha needed people the other side could not easily dismiss as beneficiaries. The room went quiet. Then Martha thought about the tape boxes. Hundreds of labels carried the same hand. The ledger carried it across decades. Leonard had handled the boxes and read the labels during preservation work. Miriam had studied the entire collection professionally. Neither would receive $1 from Elias's will. Martha said their names aloud. Sat back. That helps a lot. Martha almost laughed. The smallest habit Elias had kept, writing every name himself, might be what protected his final decision. Elaine kept reading through the materials. An hour later, she pulled a brittle carbon copy from a folder found in the cabinet. It described several songs Elias had assigned to a tiny music publisher in the early 1980s. The payment had been almost nothing. Elaine said the old agreement raised a separate copyright issue. Under federal law, estates sometimes had ways to recover or terminate old grants after enough time had passed. She would need a specialist before promising anything. Martha did not need the details yet. She understood the shape. Someone had once paid Elias very little because he had no leverage. Decades later, his estate might not be trapped forever by that bargain. The discovery changed something in Martha. She had spent her life believing she was the practical bell child who quietly protected Elias from his own choices. Now the papers told a different story. Elias had thought about storage. He had thought about ownership. He had thought about who would protect the work. He had thought about Martha. In the last years of his life, while she assumed he needed looking after, he had been building protection around her. The probate hearing was set for April. By then the mountains had begun to green at the edges. Martha arrived at the county courthouse wearing the same dark coat she used for church. Elias's harmonica rested in her purse instead of her apron. Elaine carried one thin case file in the original will. Gordon and Sheila arrived with 2 attorneys from the city. Gordon wore a gray suit and looked past Martha. Sheila gave her a small nod that did not become a greeting. The back benches filled before the judge entered. Leonard sat in a pressed shirt. Miriam had driven nearly 3 hours that morning. June Carver came in her church shoes. Tess sat beside her in a borrowed navy sweater. Several children and grandchildren of people named in Elias's ledger also came. No one had organized them. They had heard what Gordon and Sheila were trying to do. They wanted to be present. When Sheila turned and saw the room, her face changed. The people behind Martha were not there because they expected money. They were there because Elias had preserved someone they loved. The opposing attorney began with fairness. He described an elderly man living alone. He emphasized the lack of traditional witnesses on the handwritten will. He suggested isolation could make a person vulnerable. He never directly accused Martha of coercion. He arranged the facts so the accusation could sit in the room without being spoken. Elaine did not answer with a speech. She called Leonard Griggs. On the witness stand, Leonard was shown dozens of Elias's tape boxes. He identified the handwriting from years of labels he had examined during the preservation work. Elaine placed the will beside those labels. Leonard compared the letters, spacing, pressure, and repeated habits in Elias's printing. He said he had no financial interest in the estate. He also said he had no doubt the same person had written the labels and the will. The opposing attorney asked whether Leonard was a handwriting expert. Leonard said he was not. He was simply a man who had handled Elias's writing hundreds of times. He did not reach beyond that. Miriam testified. She had cataloged every labeled reel and read every page of the ledger. She explained that Elias's handwriting changed gradually as he aged but retained the same identifiable habits. The will fit that progression. She had no ownership interest in the tapes. The university had not purchased anything. She had come because accuracy mattered. Then Elaine established the dates. The will had been signed and sealed well before Martha ever entered the house. Utility records, tax notices, and Martha's own receipt fixed the timeline. For nearly 2 years after Elias died, Martha had not even used the key. The theory that she had stood over him while he wrote the will had no place to stand. The opposing side produced an old note carrying Martha's name. They suggested it showed she had been involved in Elias's affairs before his death. Elaine opened the ledger to entries from the same period. The note was an ordinary reminder about Martha's birthday. It had been written years before the will and stored among dozens of personal scraps. The suggestion collapsed under its own size. Gordon shifted in his chair. Sheila looked down. Elaine finished with the plainest facts. Elias had no spouse and no children. He had written a complete instruction in his own hand. He had preserved it with the very records that proved the hand was his. Martha had paid the taxes when no one else would. She had protected the property before anyone knew it was valuable. The judge took a recess. Martha waited in the hallway beside Tess. Neither spoke. Tess slipped her fingers around Martha's hand. The gesture was so small Martha almost missed it. When they returned, the judge ruled from the bench. She found Elias's will authentic and his intent clear. She rejected the challenge. The estate would proceed according to Elias's written instructions. The judge did not turn the ruling into a sermon. But before leaving the bench, she looked toward Gordon and Sheila. She said money often reveals priorities that ordinary hardship leaves hidden. Then she told them they should consider what their timing had communicated. The matter was closed. Martha remained seated for several seconds after everyone began moving. She had expected relief to feel larger. Instead, it felt like air returning to a room. June exhaled behind her. Leonard touched Martha's shoulder. Miriam gathered her notes. Tess held on. In the marble hallway, Sheila waited near the stairs. For a moment, Martha thought her sister might apologize. Sheila opened her mouth. Nothing came. Martha did not rescue her from the silence. Sheila turned and walked away. Gordon never approached. Martha watched them leave without triumph. The court had settled ownership, could not repair 4 decades of contempt. She no longer confused those two things. After the hearing, Martha refused every suggestion that she sell quickly. For the first time in years, urgency was not making her choices for her. Miriam arranged a formal inventory. Leonard made preservation copies under controlled conditions. A copyright attorney reviewed the old assignments Elias had signed decades earlier. Every step took longer than Martha wanted, and less time than fear had predicted. She learned to ask questions before signing. She learned to say, "Explain that again," without apologizing. She learned that not understanding a contract on the first reading did not make her foolish. It made the contract responsible for becoming clear. Tess sat through many of those conversations. At first she stayed near the wall. Later she kept the checklist. By summer she could match a real number to a ledger entry faster than anyone except Miriam. The formal appraisal confirmed what Miriam had suspected. Some recordings duplicated known songs. Others preserved versions that differed only slightly from material held elsewhere. But a significant group appeared to be unique. Several singers had never been professionally recorded. The ledger connected those voices to families and dates with unusual consistency. That completeness increased both scholarly value and licensing potential. Martha did not celebrate every favorable finding. She had learned enough by then to understand that value on paper was not cash in hand. She also knew cash was no longer the only question. An archive could buy the collection and still mishandle its meaning. A private buyer could pay more and lock the recordings away. A film company could license one voice without caring about the person behind it. Elias had left Martha ownership. He had also left her a stewardship problem. The distinction mattered. Miriam brought the first serious institutional proposal in June. A university archive wanted the ledger, preservation masters, and long-term archival rights to the collection. Their offer was substantial. More important to Martha, their plan included digitization, cataloging, climate-controlled storage, and public research access. Martha read every page with Elaine. She asked what happened to family access. She asked whether descendants could hear a parent or grandparent without paying a commercial fee. She asked whose name would appear on the collection. The archive agreed to preserve Elias Bell's name. Martha added another condition. The ledger would not be displayed as the work of a mysterious collector separated from the people he recorded. The exhibit had to explain that the singers were neighbors, relatives, workers, church members, parents, and children. Their names mattered as much as Elias's. Miriam smiled when Martha said it. That's exactly what the ledger does. The archive accepted. They also asked whether Martha wanted her own name included prominently. She declined. She had spent too much of her life watching people confuse attention with worth. This was Elias's record. Saving it did not make her its author. The old copyright grants took longer. Elaine brought in a copyright specialist to review the agreements Elias had signed decades earlier. The specialist confirmed that the estate had a lawful path to recover the old grants that mattered to the collection. The process required notices, records, and patience. Martha approved it. In the early 1980s, Elias had accepted almost nothing for work he did not know how to protect. Now the estate had a way to bring those rights back under the roof he had chosen. By August, the archive agreement was nearly complete. Martha received the first payment after closing. She sat at Elias's bench with the bank statement for nearly an hour. Tess asked whether something was wrong. Martha shook her head. I've never seen that many digits beside my name. The first substantial check she wrote was for the house. She hired local roofers and carpenters before buying anything meant to change how she looked or lived. The house had spent too many years keeping the work safe while no one kept the house safe. Martha wanted that debt paid first. The crew repaired the metal roof without changing its plain shape. They rebuilt the dropped end of the porch. They replaced rotten floor sections and left soundboards alone. Martha insisted the workbench remain exactly where Elias had placed it. A contractor suggested sanding away the dark worn patch in front of the recorder. Martha said no. That mark was 40 years of one man's elbows. It was not damage. It was evidence. By early fall, the house no longer looked abandoned. It still looked old. Martha preferred it that way. The building did not need to pretend it had never been poor. Neither did she. Then a documentary producer called Miriam. The company was making a film about disappearing musical traditions in the southern Appalachians. They had searched for an authentic lullaby for a central sequence. Miriam sent them a short cleared sample from Elias's catalog. The producer asked about licensing the full recording. It was the same cradle song Tess had recognized on her first week in the house. Martha listened to the offer in silence. The licensing fee was larger than she expected. Back-end participation could make it larger still if the film traveled well. Once again, a number arrived carrying more force than the room around it. Martha walked outside. September had lowered the creek. Goldenrod leaned over the ditch. A carpenter was measuring the porch rail. The hollow remained itself. Martha had learned to use that fact. Whenever money tried to make the world unreal, she looked at something that did not care. A stone, a creek, a bent. Then she went back inside and asked the producer 6 questions Miriam had helped her write down. Who would be credited? Would the singer's name appear? Would the recording be altered? Would the archive retain the master? Could the family receive a copy of the finished segment? What rights would the company keep after the film? The answers took 2 weeks to settle. Martha waited. The deal closed. The documentary eventually reached a large streaming audience. People who heard the lullaby began asking about the rest of the collection. Licensing requests followed. A public radio producer wanted a ballad. A regional museum wanted excerpts for an oral history installation. A record label proposed a curated archival release. Martha accepted some offers and rejected others. She no longer treated every check as proof of respect. By the time taxes, legal fees, commissions, preservation costs, and other expenses were paid, roughly $640,000 had settled to Martha from the estate and licensing work. The figure would have sounded impossible the morning she counted cash at the county window. Now it felt less like a miracle than the final arithmetic of 40 years nobody had bothered to value correctly. Martha bought no mansion. She stayed in Morrow Hollow. She repaired the house until it was safe, warm, and useful. Then she had Leonard paint a simple cedar sign for the porch. It read Elias Bell Recording Room. There was no slogan beneath it. The room reopened as a working place, not a shrine. Older singers came first. Some listened to recordings of their younger voices and had to sit down afterward. Others brought children or grandchildren who had only heard family stories about those songs. Then the younger ones began coming. Teenagers came with instruments. A girl from the next hollow brought a banjo and played while her grandmother listened. Martha recorded them because the room had never been meant to preserve only the dead. Martha learned enough about the equipment to make clean recordings. Leonard taught her levels, tape tension, and microphone placement. Miriam taught her how to write useful notes without turning people into specimens. Tess taught her how to use the digital recorder the archive donated. For someone who once insisted music belonged to other people, Martha became very good at making room for it. Tess remained the hardest person to record. She came almost every day. She answered emails. She labeled storage boxes. She carried equipment. She learned to make backup files and to distrust any folder named Final. But whenever Martha placed a microphone in front of her, Tess found a reason to move. Martha never chased her. She understood the difference between invitation and pressure. One Tuesday evening in November, the last visitors left before dark. The room held the warm, emptied feeling that follows a good gathering. A fresh reel sat on the machine. Tess remained on Elias's chair looking at her hands. Martha took the worn harmonica from her apron pocket. She had carried it for months. She placed it on the bench beside Tess. Tess looked at the harmonica, then at Martha. "I don't play." "Neither do I." Tess smiled despite herself. Martha nodded toward the microphone. Tess's smile disappeared. "I don't know if I can do that." Martha sat across from her. "You don't owe this room a song." Tess looked down again. Outside, wind moved through the bare branches above the creek. After a while, Tess asked Martha to start the machine. Martha did not ask whether she was sure. Tess had already answered. Martha pressed the switch. The reels began to turn. Tess waited through several seconds of clean tape. Then she sang the cradle song. Her voice did not sound like the elderly woman on Elias's recording. It did not sound like the foster mother Tess barely remembered. It sounded 19. It shook on the first line. It steadied on the second. Martha watched her without interrupting. The song had moved through at least 3 women before reaching this room. Elias had not created it. Martha had not rescued it alone. Tess did not own its path. But for those few minutes, she became responsible for its next breath. When she reached the last line, her voice cracked. She finished anyway. Martha let the reel run for several quiet seconds before stopping it. Tess wiped her face with both hands. Was it awful? No. Was it good? Martha considered the question. It was yours. Tess looked at the machine. That answer seemed to matter more. Martha wrote the date on a fresh label. Then she paused over the name. "How do you want me to put you down?" Tess stared at the ledger lying open beside them. The Monroe name in Elias's ledger had opened a possibility, not proved a family tree. Martha had never pretended otherwise. Still, Tess had learned that belonging did not have to begin with certainty. Now she answered without hesitation. "Tess Monroe." Martha wrote it. No qualifier, no foster placement, no question mark. Just the name Tess had chosen to carry. Tess touched the label after the pencil lifted. The gesture reminded Martha of the first day she had pressed the county receipt flat under her thumb. A small act could not change the whole past. It could still say, "This matters enough to keep." The lights in the front room glowed against the dark hollow. 2 years earlier, the house had waited behind a tax notice with no one willing to claim responsibility for it. Now people drove up the road on purpose. They brought voices. They brought stories. They brought children who learned where the microphone switch was. Cold evenings, the recording room window shone above the creek. The light did not mean every old wound had healed. It meant the room was alive again. Someone was there, someone was listening, and the work no longer had to wait in the dark. The easy lesson would be that an ignored relative might secretly be sitting on a fortune. That is not what makes Martha's choice meaningful. Most neglected rooms do not contain rare archives, and most impractical passions never become valuable property. Gordon and Sheila were allowed to think Elias had made a difficult life for himself. They were allowed to worry about the unsafe house, his isolation, or the money he never seemed to have. Concern would have required curiosity. Contempt required only certainty. Their failure was not that they missed an investment. It was that they decided Elias was not worth knowing until an appraisal changed the conversation. Martha was not free of that mistake either. She loved her brother, yet she had never entered the room where he spent the most important part of his life. The difference was that she left enough respect intact for discovery to remain possible. She paid the taxes before she knew there was anything to gain. That decision did not make her morally perfect. It simply meant her loyalty existed before the reward did. Grant Hollander represents a different kind of danger in the story. He understood that urgent need can make a modest offer feel like rescue. Martha did need money, and $20,000 would once have seemed enormous to her. What protected her was not financial sophistication. It was enough patience to let neutral people explain what she actually held. Leonard, Miriam, and Elaine mattered because they increased Martha's ability to choose without taking the choice away from her. That is a useful distinction whenever help, expertise, and unequal power meet. Good guidance should make a person more capable of deciding, not more frightened of refusing. The probate fight adds another uncomfortable point. A court can determine ownership and authenticate a document. It cannot manufacture the years of relationship that were missing before the dispute began. Martha's victory did not require a family reunion, and Sheila's silence in the hallway was not transformed into an apology. Some consequences remain relational even after the legal question is settled. Elias's careful labels also show why ordinary documentation can carry emotional weight far beyond paperwork. He wrote names because the names mattered to him. Later, those same habits made his intentions legible when people tried to erase them. Tessa's place in the story brings the idea closer to the present. She does not receive a perfect genealogy, a repaired childhood, or a sudden replacement family. She receives something smaller and more believable, a room where her voice is recorded under the name she chooses to carry. Being seen cannot undo every absence, but it can interrupt the habit of treating absence as proof that nothing belongs to you. The strongest response to this story is not to search every attic for hidden treasure. It is to notice whose work, memory, or quiet persistence we have dismissed because we did not understand its use. Recognition after loss may still matter, but attention offered while someone is present costs much less. The most durable inheritance here is the habit of noticing before silence makes the decision permanent.